Niall, you think a lot about empires. You've written about the British Empire. You've written more controversially about the American Empire. I once watched you debate in Washington about whether there was an American empire, and some disagreed with you. How do you see? How does this war look to you in that longer context? How does the long history of the Russian Empire and of the Soviet Empire help explain what we're watching now?
Well, thanks, Anne, and thanks to Victor for inviting me, I think, to my 10th Yes conference. And I never thought back in late February that we would be meeting here in Kyiv this year. Congratulations to you, Victor, and all of your team for making this happen. The odds are against you when you fight an empire because empires are big. The Russian Federation is 28 times larger in territorial extent than Ukraine. Its gross domestic product is roughly 9 times larger. Its population is 3.3 times larger. That's the thing about empires, economies of scale. And the reality is that under a lot of those square miles, there are natural resources that continue to be sold on international markets because the sanctions regime is far from a perfect shutdown of Russian trade. And so this empire is still in business. It still has the cash flow to wage a war of attrition. And you might therefore assume, and this is what some so-called realists do assume, that time is on Russia's side and the odds are fundamentally against Ukraine. But if that were true, then historically, presumably North Vietnam would have lost to what I've called the American Empire, and presumably the Soviet Union would not have broken against the rocks of Afghanistan. The thing about empires that is also true is that they decline. They rot. And Ukraine is fighting against a declining empire. And that's really the critical point. Now, I'm wearing a black tie because Queen Elizabeth II had just died, and as a Briton, I'm in mourning. But what was the key theme of that 70-year reign? Managing, with as much dignity as possible, the unraveling of an empire. And what has not happened in Russia is that recognition that came gradually to England after World War II, that it's over, So it seems to me the key here is not the scale of empire, but the extent of the rot. And I think what we have seen since February the 24th is just how rotten this Russian empire is. Look, I was in Rome before I came here. And Rome makes you think about the history of empires like no other place. And I had an epiphany. I suddenly thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if in a few years from now, tourists were wandering around Moscow the way they wander around Rome today, looking at the ruins of the Kremlin and saying, you know, some of those Tsars were such bastards. But the later Tsars were the worst bastards of all, and that would be very Roman. And you know, that's going to happen. It's only a matter of time before this empire goes down, as they all do, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I was very inspired by what President Zelensky said earlier. It reminded me of what this is most like, because historians' real job is to tell you what things are like. This is like one of those great 19th century wars for national liberation. Go back to the Greeks. Think of the Italian Risorgimento. There's something of the Garibaldi about President Zelensky, and it is a classic process where a nation comes together in war finds its national identity precisely in that struggle against the rotten empire. Then Greeks versus Ottomans, then Italians versus Habsburgs. That is, I think, what we're witnessing today. And the great news is that though it takes time, and though some of these battles for liberation did not succeed, think of Poland's unsuccessful bids in the 19th century, ultimately the empires lose. And that is the most important message I want to convey to you today. As President Zelensky said, a winter of discontent lies ahead for all of us, but especially for Ukraine. When one looks at this war as a military historian, the striking thing is, compared with all the wars of the recent past, the very high casualty rate, I'm assuming on both sides. We know more about the Russian data. This is a bloody war, and no one should underestimate how bloody it is. But the message I want to convey is that Ukraine can win this war. This can be a successful war of national liberation and unity, and it can help that decaying empire on its way from being a tyranny, to use a favorite word of Tim's, to being the tourist destination that I hope that Moscow one day will be.